In Theros, Wizards of the Coast unveiled their latest magical setting. A world of gods and devotion, of monsters and heroes, a world steeped in the rich reimaginings of Greek myth and legend. Now it's time once more to go inside R&D, inside Born of the Gods, and inside the mind of a certain planeswalker who has been very busy since last we met.
Xenagos has ascended. He is now a god. He's been machinating these plots since we first saw him in Theros. He's set up these rituals. He's been gaining power through revels, and then he orchestrates the Great Revel, and the energy from that revel propels him to godhood, and he has now become one of the Pantheon, much to the rest of the gods' dismay.
When we start a design, we start before anybody else gets their hands on it, and that includes the creative team. So what happens is, until the creative team gets involved, we kind of have a filler story that's just kind of enough to us to build around, knowing that creative will come and actually put the real story in. So the interesting thing is, in the sort of filler story, our bad guy was a planeswalker that like brought dreams to life, you know, and that for a while it was like Dark Jace, and it's just us screwing around until we actually have some real thing. So the interesting thing is, Xenagos was created by the creative team, and that didn't happen until like they started putting the story together, and all of a sudden like, oh yeah, one of the gods, you know, there's this guy and he becomes a god and he's the enemy, and I'm like, oh okay, wow, I was not expecting that at all.
Yeah, the different part about Xenagos is that he transitioned from basically kind of a mortal planeswalker kind of guy into a god. And we did have to work out that transition. So his initial design was as a satyr, but a lot, you know, we gave him some unique features. When he transitioned into a god, like I said, the sort of prints that were on him from his sort of partying became infused with Nyx. So that became part of his look. And also his horns became bigger and sort of curvier. They sort of grew out. And of course, based on the artwork, he sort of took on this godlike aspect where he's as big as a mountain, you know, kind of look as well, just to give him an epic feel.
Xenagos was very tricky to get into the right spot. We wanted him to be aggressive, but not insta-game over. We played with a lot of different kind of berserky, overrunny type abilities before we found the right one.
When creating the rest of the Pantheon, we wanted to touch on these other two color combinations, but we wanted to divorce them from some of the flavor that we had seen in Ravnica in the guilds. So the direction for Afara is not just the law creation and the slavish devotion to bureaucracy that we saw in the Azorius. Instead, she's playing on much more of the active and progressive aspects of blue-white.
Afara is the god of civic wisdom and cities and sort of urban planning. I know that doesn't, but she is the god of architecture, of great works. She is the god of industry. So if you imagine beautiful buildings, beautiful statues, that is her domain.
We wanted her to really evoke the feel of a city, the feel of building a community. So you bring in another creature, well, that's a white thing. You draw another card, that's a blue thing, and you keep building and building and building.
Afara was interesting because the wording ended up on that card being a little bit tortured, but we thought it was really important that it work for Commander with things like Astral Slide as well as Momentary Blink. So we ended up going back to the Innistrad, in your upkeep, check last turn, like the Werewolves wording, even though it's a bit twisted, but it lets you build the Commander deck that you want to build with that.
Karametra is kind of a cross between Demeter and Hestia. She is god of family, god of hearth, but she's also a badass. You should see her, like the weapon that she carries. You don't want to get on her wrong side.
So for Karametra, we tried pretty hard to make a commander themed one, so we knew we wanted some kind of creatures and tokens and ramping or something that's traditionally very green-white. So we settled on a very, very large power toughness for Karametra, and hopefully people like her in Commander.
We do have to be careful about mana acceleration. The fundamental structure of the game is that you can cast a 1-drop on turn 1 and a 2-drop on turn 2. But it can be very exciting to accelerate, faster than the game normally allows. We have to watch out to make sure that that doesn't isn't always the dominant strategy. We want it to sometimes be a thing you can do and sometimes not be very powerful, so that games are different over different periods.
Karametra was one of the most difficult gods to get right because we got really good feedback on a version of the card that searched for lands, but we also don't want things that search for lands repeatedly to be one of the strongest constructed cards in the set. So getting it to a balance point where it was appealing for people who wanted to do that sort of thing, but not super overwhelming to the point where even if you weren't into that, you were going to do it if you wanted to win, was tricky. I'm happy with where we ended up, but it took us a while to get there.
Karametra was my personal favorite of the gods as we were playtesting. Just the more creatures you do, the more ramp you do, the bigger creatures you can play, the more ramp you can do, and until you just...
We knew that when we were creating the Pantheon for Theros, we wanted a representation of the god of war that is built into ancient Greek myth very solidly. But we thought there were so many good aspects of a god of war that we actually ended up creating two different expressions of that idea. One expression is Mogus, who is the god of slaughter. He's the expression of all the aspects of war that are deadly, that are vicious, that are grim.
Some color pairs are very easy to design for, others are harder. Black-red tends to want to destroy things and want to hurt the opponent, so they're usually in agreement about that sort of thing, so it works out pretty well.
So by name, Mogus is the god of slaughter. He is also the god of misery and suffering. One of the things that you may not have thought about is that it is actually very difficult to make a fun magic card that accurately represents a god of misery.
Through most of development, we were looking at Mogus abilities that were brutal, just killed everything, just total annihilation and pain and brutality, and was super unfun. And now we've got an ability that definitely painful, but will bring the pain over a much longer extended period of time.
I hope that the card makes your opponent a little bit miserable, but not so miserable that they want to stop playing Magic with you.
The Minotaurs of Theros are savage and brutal. They are very low on jobs and culture. If you were born a Minotaur, you're going to pick up a weapon and you're going to hit somebody with it. That's pretty much your job. There's definitely some shamanism among the Minotaurs here. You'll see some pieces of art and cards that depict Minotaur magic being used. But a lot of what the day-to-day of being a Minotaur is to find someone in one of the polises and smush them. So it's pretty familiar territory for blue-black to be the colors of lying, deception, cunning, evil. Phoenix goes a little further than that. He loves upsetting the natural order of things. The pantheon of major gods on Theros kind of chafe him, and he's looking to get one over on all of them. In fact, he's very happy that Xenagos is trying to break in and upset this pantheon that amuses him to no end.
Phoenix likes to cause trouble, and he believes that when Xenagos ascends that he'll be able to somehow turn the situation to his own favor. He's threatened by Xenagos, but he feels like he's smart enough to take control of the situation.
Phoenix works differently than most of the other gods. Most of the gods promote more aggressive decks, want you to get creatures out there and just attack, build up bigger creatures so you can attack. This is a god for a more controlling deck.
So Phoenix is a good example of us taking a god and really like trying to put it into a certain archetype, that being a mill archetype. It's also a mill archetype that might be based more around creatures and toughness of creatures, and it's really, I think, trying to trigger off of a lot of Johnny instincts of like, how do I build this right? And like, certainly not all the gods are just going to go to any old deck, and this is one of those where we're trying to create a god that really gets you thinking about new decks and building new decks.
Many years ago, we were working on Duels of the Planeswalkers. It was the second or third version, I don't remember exactly. But we make decks, and then there's Planeswalkers that represent the decks. So 2 of the decks, the creative team came and said, look, we have no Planeswalker that makes any sense to go with either of these 2 decks. And they said, we have an idea. What if we just make up some Planeswalkers, and we'll put them in, and then if they're popular, well, maybe later we'll put them in the game. So they made Ral Zarek and Kiora. And were they popular? Instantaneously, like, 2 seconds after they were in Duels of the Planeswalkers, I mean, people are emailing me like, when are we going to see the cards? When are we going to see them? And so like, okay, we knew we had to make them. So Raul Zarek was from Ravnica. He's in the Izzet clan. So like, it was a perfect fit. Like, obviously we go to Ravnica, we got to have Raul Zarek. But where to put Kiora was a little trickier. So what we realized was she loves sea serpents. Like, she loves giant water monsters. And it turns out, you know what Theros has? Giant sea serpents. Krakens and such, right? So we're like, oh, I mean, she's not from Theros, but it's a world she'd want to visit. It's her kind of world. And so we knew that would be the perfect place to put it.
When she gets here, she notices there's a race of merfolk creatures, of Tritons here on Theros, who treat her as an avatar of the sea god. And frankly, she doesn't mind this treatment. She doesn't mind being seen as an avatar of Thassa.
So with Kiora, one thing to keep in mind is she does have a small starting loyalty for a 4-mana Planeswalker. However, green is very well known for being able to ramp out things quickly, and Sylvan Caryatid is one of the more popular and powerful cards, and so you can often get her out on turn 3, and then she can then easily protect herself with her +1 ability, and then you might have, for example, the Caryatid to help keep her alive, and so she can go up quite quickly, and then having her other ability to explore is also another quite powerful way to ramp in its own right.
So like, we've been saving her for Theros, knowing that's where she needed to go. Meanwhile, people are just bombarding me. Where's Kiora? Where's Kiora? Where's Kiora? And like, I kept like, one day, I promise you, one day we'll make her. And finally, here's Kiora. Stop writing me, please.
While the gods and their ancient world origins may be familiar territory, Magic thrives on the new. In part 2, we'll pay tribute to the men and women inside R&D who inspired the great new Magic mechanics in Born of the Gods.